Hello, everyone. Rachel here with the Path International Education Department. I am happy to have each of you with us for our first equine lecture. We are honored and incredibly excited to welcome Karen Lassell today. As equine manager, Karen is responsible for the care of the Morgan horse herd at William H. Miner Agricultural Research Institute in Chazy, New York. In addition, Karen directs the Institute's equine education programs, is a regional vice president for the New York State Horse Council, and is currently the president of the Champlain Valley Morgan Horse Association. Miner Institute's herd of Morgan horses, qualified staff, and outstanding facilities has attracted research collaborations with leaders in this field of study at Virginia Tech, Michigan State, Penn State, and Cornell University. Just some housekeeping. While you are listening in on the lecture, your line will remain muted. If you have any questions, please type them into the question box of your control panel. Karen will address your questions at the conclusion of the presentation. With that, please join me in giving Karen a warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you folks today. So as Rachel mentioned, I am the equine manager of Miner Institute, the private nonprofit agricultural research and education facility. We have a working dairy as well as the horse herd. And the programs that are centered around our Morgan horses include educational opportunities for adults, youth, the community. We publish a newsletter and have the summer experience in equine management, which is a 13-week college internship program that applications are due on February 15th. So we've had a number of students come through that have gone on to work in therapeutic riding, and it would be an honor to have more in that field. So what Rachel had asked me to talk on a little bit with looking at horse nutrition and care and so forth is how to care for these sort of senior horses. And for me, this quote, "The outside of a horse is good for humankind," is certainly what keeps us all coming back to the barn and looking after these horses. And it is certainly our responsibility to look after those that are trusted into our care, and they deserve the best that we can do for them. So with age comes wisdom, and with wisdom comes a whole lot of other things, often therapy program horses that are donated to nonprofits such as yourselves, our senior horses or our higher maintenance horses. And so there are things that we can hopefully do to help improve that for the horse and keep them working happy and healthy long into their senior years. As a disclaimer, I am not a veterinarian, so any veterinary issues or things that come up as you're looking at your older horses should be worked with your veterinarian and or your farrier if it's foot related issues. So things that can change in the horse are digestion, immunity can be depressed. They're certainly going to have an increased risk of colic, tooth issues, lameness concerns, as well as, really trying to look after what their weight is. So I thought I'd do a quick, brief reintroduction or review of nutrition basics, starting with the digestive system. So for how the horse is put together, their mouth, which is the first entry point of the digestive system, they have the teeth for chewing, so they've got their lips and incisors pick up the feed for grazing or so forth. Those incisors bite and grab. It then with the tongue, gets pushed back to the molars, and the molars are the grinding surface of that. Horses evolved to eat about 16 hours a day. So we're going to keep that in mind as we follow food through the digestive tract. So as far as the saliva goes up in the mouth as well, it begins the breakdown of food. There's some enzymes in saliva that starts that, and then it acts as a lubricant to help slide the food down the esophagus down into the stomach, as well as through the whole digestive tract. And then finally, saliva has a buffer in it that helps counteract some stomach acid and protects the lining of the stomach. So going further down the digestive tract, the esophagus is the long muscular tube that connects from the mouth down to the stomach, and it is got peristalsis, which only flows one direction. So when people say horses can't throw up, That's essentially why, because those muscles only move food from the mouth down to the stomach. The horses cannot vomit, which becomes important in colics and things like that. The stomach holds about between 2 to 4.5 gallons, depending upon the size of the horse. And that produces acids to break down those proteins and fats. And this is where pancreatic juices are supplied to begin breaking down the fibers. Then on into the small intestine, which is about 70 feet long or so. That is where proteins and starches and simple sugars, fats, all those fat-soluble vitamins, minerals are started to be absorbed in this spot. And this is the part, the foregut of the horse, the stomach and the small intestine, which is where all those simple sugars are available. Everything now that is going to pass into the next part of the intestine, towards the hindgut and into the cecum, is a lot of those, hopefully, those fibers that are left behind that the simple stomach part of the digestion didn't work on. So now the cecum is this great big fermentation vat. It holds a whole lot. It's about 4 feet long, holds quite a bit of material, as well as all these bacteria that work to ferment any undigested food from the foregut. And from that breakdown of the fibers, nutrients are created by those bacteria in the form of volatile fatty acids and B vitamins. And the horse uses volatile fatty acids. Those get absorbed as energy. And when I say that it's a sensitive ecosystem, it means that the bacteria that are in that hindgut doing that digestion work are pretty sensitive to changes in diet, to changes in environment. So people often recommend that you change a horse's diet over a period of 10 days. If you've got a horse that's got even more compromised issues, whether it's a metabolic issue or some other disease process, 2 to 3 weeks is an even better time to switch that, to help give those hindgut bacteria more opportunity to keep up with those changes. Drastic changes can cause some big problems in the hindgut of the horse. So continuing on through the hindgut, the large colon, which is about 10 to 12 feet long or so, that is where most of the water starts to really get absorbed out of this digesta. Some of the short chain fatty acids are also picked up by the large intestine, and electrolytes are found in that part, and that's where the horse has access to that into their blood. And then the small colon, that's the part where the last bit of water is removed, and that's what then forms the fecal balls so that we can clean the stall the next day. So when thinking about feeding the horse, one of the things to also be aware of is body condition score. And Dr. Don Henneke years ago came up with this Henneke score of a 1 to 9. And there's all of these different spots, as shown on the chart of the horse, where you would feel for determining whether this horse is underweight, overweight, or just right. And certainly practicing doing body condition scoring and maintain those records to know, how the horse has changed over time. With body condition score, there can definitely be some age-related changes or some breed differences. A quarter horse is going to have a different ideal body condition score shape than a Morgan than a thoroughbred. So understanding some differences in that with like the crest shape or the rump shape can be a little bit different. But right, that feel of the fat over the ribs is probably the best indicator of their weight. So there's other ways that you can do to help get a hold of what their weight is if you don't have a scale. Those heart girth tapes that often you can buy in feed stores, they're a great place to start, but I find that they're pretty consistently inaccurate, and I would suggest doing the more advanced measurement to get a closer estimate of the horse's body weight. And this calculation that's on the screen here, there are great videos available online of how to do this, but this one is for adult mature horses. So it's you essentially the heart girth times 2, so double the heart girth, times the body length. So I think that's actually supposed to be heart girth plus heart girth, times body length divided by 330, gives your approximate weight in pounds. I will have to send that out to Rachel and she can update that for me. I think I got that wrong. I use a digital scale here at Miner, so I haven't had to do this measurement in a long time. But essentially, knowing the weight of your horse helps you know if the weight has changed, as well as figuring out how you're going to feed them. So senior horses, which I'm guessing is the majority of what we're looking at, have a certain special kind of challenges as well. And most of the horses that I've met in therapeutic riding programs are tending to be on the older side, and it's because they've got that great been there, done that experiences under their belt. So chronological age literature tells us that a senior horse is about 15 years old and then older. I think with advances that we've got in modern veterinary medicine, in good feeding, and just an awareness of how to take care of horses better, horses are living longer and longer. So maybe 15, I don't know, 15 is the new 8. So physiological age, this is also a very individual. So this is kind of when do they actually look and act like a senior horse? And that can range anywhere from 15 into their 20s. So it's very individual. Oftentimes we look at it as behavior and attitude changes, body condition score change we're going to be watching for, as well as just an overall decreased vigor. So some of the challenges that can come with managing senior horses is first and foremost that loss of teeth. So they will, as horses' teeth are continuously erupting through their whole lives, so they're constantly wearing down those surfaces. Loss of teeth can be a disease process as well as just a form of just a manifestation of old age. And they will keep wearing them out and out until essentially the tooth is fully erupted out of their mouth and they're left with just their jaw and their gums. Horses can function perfectly fine without teeth. It just requires some a little bit more attention to their diet. And then mouth or jaw pain. Certainly if the horse has been eating strangely or holding its jaw funny because of teeth issues, can manifest in some jaw pain. And we recommend generally that horses are checked every 6 months for those senior horses. Most adult horses can get away with once a year a dental checkup, but senior horses should probably have it every 6 months, particularly if they've got opposing teeth from the one that is lost that are not in wear, to make sure that those teeth show up like that. We had a senior horse here at Miner Institute that still had almost all of his teeth at age 31, but the wearing surface was polished smooth like porcelain, and you could hear his teeth and jaw kind of squeaking as he was trying to chew on fibers on his all liquid diet, but he had squeaky teeth. So he still had plenty of teeth, they just couldn't actually grind the fibers so much anymore. Older horses also will have a decreased saliva production, and part of that's because as we concentrate a senior horse's diet, they're not eating that 16 hours a day anymore for the most part. They're not chewing as much. If they're not chewing as much, they're not swallowing as much. So they have less saliva, loss of that lubrication. You can have an increased risk of choke in those kinds of horses. And choke for a horse is where it's not a breathing emergency. In human beings, when we choke, there's something lodged in our windpipe. For horses, the term choke is a little different in that they have a food bolus gets lodged in their esophagus and they can't swallow it or have it come back up very readily. So you'll often see some, goo come out of their nose and mouth, some sort of green food like goo. They may move their head around and cough and so forth. It is definitely a veterinary issue, but it is not a breathing emergency issue. So they will not run out of oxygen before the vet can get there for you. These horses also, because of the decreased saliva and that their stomach is empty more, have an increased risk of gastric ulcers. Some other of the challenges going on is that an increased risk of colic can happen for these horses. They are, because they're eating less fiber, if we've made their diet be more soft food and so forth, less fiber is going to cause an increased rate of passage of the feed. So the less fibrous your hay, or if they're not eating as much hay, the food moves faster through the stomach and into the small intestine and into the large intestine. And That will cause increased gas production because those hindgut bugs have access to a whole lot more simple sugars and starches. The things that should have been digested in the stomach and small intestine have moved too quickly, have landed in the hindgut, and now we're feeding the hindgut bacteria that should be eating fiber, we're feeding them sugar and starches. So they're going to produce more gas, they're going to produce possibly some endotoxins, start to have more problems in that hindgut if we're feeding the bad bugs too much sugar and not as many of the good bugs getting fiber. And as well, like I said, the decrease in water and saliva can increase impaction colic risk, which for those of us who are living in the cold climates, like it is here today in Chazy, less water and less saliva certainly can add to our problems in terms of an impaction colic because they don't drink as much and the fibers don't move through their gut. As horses age, it's just a natural function of aging is the decreased efficiency of the body's ability to absorb nutrients. So all of those things, vitamins, energy, so if you're not absorbing as much energy, the horse will manifest that as some weight loss. If you are not able to absorb as much protein, then they may have some muscle loss over there. Particularly, you'll see it first over their top line, or they may not be quite as strong as they used to be. So as we're considering their decreased ability to absorb nutrients, it is both the quantity and quality of feed that we have to take into account when we start feeding these horses. Oftentimes with senior horses, the other thing that comes with that is Cushing syndrome or pituitary pars intermediate dysfunction. And it happens to about 30% of senior horses will end up with Cushing's. You'll see it on the outside. It shows up as coat changes, maybe some muscle loss like over their top line. They might have sort of a pot-bellied appearance. They're going to drink more water and flood their stall. If they live inside, you will notice this for sure. Regional adiposity, they may or may not have this. This is those kind of strange deposits of fat over the horse's body, and I'll show in the next slide what that looks a little more likely. And those horses, they can be insulin resistant. Not all horses that are Cushing's have insulin resistance, and not all insulin resistant horses are Cushing's, but they are often together, one after the other. So with the equine metabolic syndrome, which is what we often are calling insulin resistance, this is the regional adiposity, and you can see, I'm going to move my mouse over here on this horse, you get these funny fat pads. This horse has got a lot of, beyond regional adiposity, this horse is also very obese, but because you can have a horse that's got not a lot of covering over their ribs and still have these shoulder pads, still have an excess crest, which may even be really hard, not a very soft, flexible crest, and these pads over the hindquarters or the tail head as well. Equine metabolic syndromes, because of what insulin resistance is essentially the tissues that are meant to take up sugars that are digested by the stomach and the small intestine. Those tissues don't recognize that they're supposed to be taking up the sugar. So the body produces insulin to connect, in general, in a healthy horse and human. Insulin helps deliver sugar from the digestive tract and the blood, or in the blood, into the tissues where the horse will have use of it, and whether that's muscle tissue, fat tissue, and in the liver. If the horse is insulin resistant, it means that those tissues are not absorbing glucose the way they should. So the body adds more insulin and more insulin. So you'll see great big spikes in insulin in those horses trying to respond to that sugar that's in the bloodstream. Insulin itself is great stuff when it works right, but it will cause inflammation. It's an inflammatory response when it's in the rest of the body in excess amounts. And those sorts of things can set the horse up for a little bit more just general body inflammation. And inflammation like that can also lead to laminitis. Another metabolic challenge that often happens in draft horses, any of the stock horse breeds, is polysaccharide storage myopathy, or you'll see it PSSM. And there's a couple different types of that. Some of them are more genetically linked than others, but they all essentially need to be fed the same. Those horses need to be fed a lower sugar diet and possibly some higher fat to help them. They will manifest as a horse that looks like they're tying up. So tying up is pretty well a severe muscle cramp as the body is trying to get to the sugar and it can't get out of the muscles to be available for energy. So oftentimes, either senior horses or horses that are donated, I work for a private nonprofit and understand that oftentimes the horses that are donated are not 100% sound, or they may have some issue or another. So sometimes they may have some arthritis, or certainly laminitis is a big one that comes along with insulin-resistant horses and senior horses. So managing body condition score is really key to help keep horses feeling more sound. So if they've got arthritis issues or there's too much weight on their feet, that can it can compound their problems. So we're going to try to shoot for a body condition score of a 5, and maybe even sometimes if you're working with your vet, something a little less than that, maybe like a 4.5, so that you can just feel a little bit of ribs or just barely see the ribs on a horse, as opposed to having them be a complete covered in a little bit of fat. A little bit less weight can be easier on their feet and their joints. And certainly if they have laminitis, we want to try to manage the cause. Laminitis can be caused by any number of things. There's road founder, which is a horse that has had an injury-related founder, or that's a weight-bearing one. They can do that. If it happened from a one-time grain overload, hopefully that's a one-time event and you can take care of that. But more often than not, for horses like the ones we'd be working with, may have some chronic issues, and we're going to try really hard to manage their diet such that they don't have recurring bouts of laminitis. For arthritis, there's any number of dietary supplements that show some promise and some good work with dealing with arthritis issues, some chondroitin, hyaluronic acid or HA, MSM, vitamin C, some omegas, as well as vitamin E is a great one for arthritis. Glucosamine, I have a question mark next to it, because if your horse is insulin resistant, there is definitely some question as to whether or not glucosamine is always appropriate. So knowing your horse really well and how sensitive they are to sugars in their diet could dictate whether or not glucosamine is something you want to give them. Definitely worth asking a veterinarian about that, but anything that's got that glucose with an insulin-resistant horse should kind of raise your awareness right away. Oftentimes other horses may have COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is known as heaves, or I think equine asthma is the current term, but it all means the same thing. Essentially, they have a hard time breathing, and whether that's from an illness when they were younger or a allergy issue, things like that. Certainly medically, there's things we can do. This horse in the picture here is being administered some inhalers through the aero hippus. It's a flow vent or a equine aero mask, and we've got a couple of these at Minor. I've had a few older horses with COPD, and they can be managed really well on these kinds of things, but they are expensive. So if there's other management techniques we can use to try to really decrease their response to that, is what we want to do first. So dietary wise, the way you're going to manage these horses is you're going to wet their hay. They might get a complete feed, which is going to have fewer dust particles than a hay would, and then using a hay steamer. Hay steamers are also a little on the pricey side, but there's a lot of great research coming out that shows how well they do in terms of improving both the palatability of the hay, but reducing mold and dust, which is perfect for these COPD horses. So certainly, like I said, I am not a veterinarian, so I suggest getting veterinary advice on any dental work, deworming issues, metabolic issues, and certainly for deworming, we don't want to spend all this time working on a great diet for the horse only to find out later that we're just feeding a bunch of worms. So make sure your worming program is up to date, and certainly with new evidence out there, and we've done some of the research on this as well here ourselves, on resistance to dewormers, doing fecal tests before and after you deworm, and to get to know your whole herd that way is going to help you know whether or not your deworming is actually working. And then feeding the horse as an individual. As much as it's easier if we can put them all out in a field and let them eat like these two girls are in the picture, horses do oftentimes do better being fed individually. It's hard to manage weight issues and metabolic issues as a whole herd. And you may actually need to deliver the feed individually if the horse can't compete or doesn't choose to get into the fray if they're out in a group, because socially horses do really well out groups for the most part. But if they're not willing to get in and get into the fray to get a pile of hay or to eat their grain, you may need to separate them out for feeding times at least to make sure they actually get the meals that they need. So in looking at, as we start to calculate weight and diets for these horses, understanding, going back to that, that slide where I talked about how to know how much the horse weighs, is we want to aim for a minimum of 1.5% of their body weight a day in hay or in feed, and up to 3% in dry food. I generally aim here at Minor Institute for about a 2% body weight per day to start with. I may decrease that a little bit, closer down to 1.5% if they need to be losing weight, or I might increase it if they need to gain weight, or if it's particularly cold out like it is today. All the horses that are outside are eating free choice hay. So for horses that have some teeth issues, like I said, feeding at the front end is where we start for the most part. Forage replacements are going to be really important. If that horse can't chew hay anymore, or if your hay isn't of great quality, because there are certainly years that good hay is hard to come by, beet pulp makes a fantastic replacement for some hay. And you can replace up to about 3 pounds worth of hay in your horse's diet with beet pulp before you have to start to worry about any major nutritional shifts. So more than 3 pounds of beet pulp in their diet can start to interfere with the calcium phosphorus ratio of a ration. So make sure to think about that before you add more than 3 pounds worth. And make sure also, if you're going to weigh this feed out, do it when it's dry. Hay cubes can be forage cubes. Hay cubes can be spectacular for feeding horses that are hard keepers, because you'll still get that fiber that the hindgut needs. It tends to have very consistent quality on forage cubes. They're easy to handle, and there are some companies that are actually making forage cubes that are very specifically balanced for horses that need lower sugars in their diets. There's pelleted hay stretchers that you can use to help feed horses that are having teeth issues. Chopped forages, and oftentimes chopped forages, they come bagged, and they may have a coating on them, which it used to be more often with molasses. I think more forage companies are now coating with an oil to help keep dust particles down. So those are good ones also for COPD horses. And then certainly there's plenty of complete feeds out there, often labeled as senior feeds. And I'm going to go back up to beet pulp, because I think I forgot to mention the difference between shreds versus pellets. Oftentimes the pellets are bound together with molasses. So if you've got a horse that's needing to be on a lower sugar, lower NSC diet, pellets may not be the way to go, but you can soak them and then rinse them. Versus shreds come already shredded up. Beet pulp is just a byproduct of the sugar beet industry. So these are not the same as the ones we can get in the grocery store that we put on our salads. This is a whole different family of beets, and shreds will fluff up really quickly in water. Pellets will take a little bit longer, but oftentimes pellets are cheaper. So if you're going for a less expensive option, the pellets might be the way to go. And then if you need to rinse the sugars out, you can just rinse the sugars out. So certainly any and all of those things can be wet or soaked for ease of chewing and swallowing. If you soak feeds, any dry hays for any period of time, you will start to leach out some of the nutrients in them unless they get fed the water part of it too. So soaking of hay can be a great way to take sugars out to manage a laminitic horse, but you're going to have to replace all the other nutrients that are leached out as well. Soaking hay in water doesn't just take out the sugars, it takes out all kinds of other stuff and basically just leaves some fibers behind for the horse to chew on. But you can wet and dampen hay down for ease of swallowing, as well as beet pulp. And I think this picture here, I will point to it. So there's some beet pulp pellets here. There's some forage cubes. And then underneath there, we had a ration balancer that we would use to add to this horse's diet. So most ration balancers supplied by grain companies are essentially vitamins, minerals, and protein. So this was a horse that was on an all wet diet because he had the squeaky polished teeth and couldn't chew hay anymore. So several times a day he received a bucket that looked sort of like this. So we'd start with the dry ingredients and add the water. And I kept it in a refrigerator in the summer months to keep it from fermenting, because usually by the time everything was fully absorbed and we were ready to feed it on a hot day, it would have started to ferment by then. So we feed these soaked hay, so he had lots of fiber, both from the beet pulp and the forage cubes, and then got the rest of his nutrients through those ration balancer pellets. If possible, feeding at ground level is best for both the horse's airway. You know, horses are designed, again, to graze for up to 16 hours a day, and they graze with their nose to the ground, which really allows that upper airway system to drain, to keep it cleared out. If we feed them, you know, even in hanging buckets on the wall or hay nets, things like that, we're interfering with that natural drainage system. So, and as well for that chewing and swallowing, they're less likely to choke if they are fed at ground level. Certainly hard to do if you've got a horse that likes to paw at their bucket or things like that. But if they'll let you feed them at ground level to reduce choke, that's better. And then as well, you can, the bigger the tub you can put it in, the more thin you can spread out the food. They're going to eat, it's going to take them a little bit longer to eat it so that they aren't, you know, chewing and swallowing their whole meal in a matter of minutes. You know, again, we want to try to keep bits of food in front of them for as long as possible during the day. So whether, you know, a few large round stones in there as well that they have to move around, or, you know, sometimes people like to put a salt blocks in there, just something so they have to move it around so they can't just bolt their feed and eat it in 3 gulps. So some of the different diseases that we're going to try to manage: equine metabolic syndrome, pituitary pars intermedia dysfunction, the PSSM, that's the muscle, the sugar muscles, all those things we're going to try to manage NSC levels of the diet. And what NSC is non-structural carbohydrates. Those are the sugars and starches that are available to the foregut. And we can't tell what those are unless you do a forage analysis. There is no way you can look at hay or forages and know what that is based on anything else just by looking at it. So it may have great color, it may have, you know, no foreign material, it may not be dusty, and those things we can tell visually, but you can't tell without doing a forage analysis. Almost all feed companies will do a forage analysis for you, will test the hay. If not, there are many labs around the country. I use up here in the Northeast, we use equine-analytical labs at Cornell University, and they can turn around a forage analysis in almost no time for us. Ideally, for these horses that have metabolic issues, we're going to try to shoot for a less than 10% non-structural carbohydrate in the diet. That's for the really sensitive horses. Other literature that you can read will say to go for under 12%, but certainly we don't want to be getting way up high. And there's some hay that I've had tested here at Minor Institute that I've had 18 to 20% non-structural carbohydrates. And then pasture is oftentimes a source of those sugars, and there's a lot of great ways to manage a horse out on pasture to make sure they're not getting too much NSCs. Certainly first thing in the morning is one of the best times to graze, actually from about midnight to 9 to 10 a.m. is when the sugars are lowest in those pasture grasses. The horse in the picture here is wearing a grazing muzzle, which, if that doesn't make them more stressed and anxious, then a grazing muzzle is a great way to slow down their consumption of grasses when they're out on the pasture. If it just causes them more stress is cortisol, stress is inflammation. We don't want to add to the inflammation of horses that are metabolically sensitive. So we have to kind of play that one by ear. When talking about NSCs, one of the other things that can get a little confusing if you've got a horse that's really on the line metabolically and you're trying really hard to watch this is that there's also, you'll read in literature, NFC, so non-fiber carbohydrates. And NFC and NSC are often used interchangeably when people are talking, but they really aren't the same things. NSC, non-structural carbohydrates, is the actual measured amount of sugars and starches in that, and fructans in that feed. Non-fiber carbohydrates is a calculation. It's a math solution where essentially they start with 100% and subtract out everything that's not the sugars and assume that everything that's left is your carbohydrate level. They're similar, but for real, you want an SC if you're trying to manage that very carefully. For these horses as well, we're going to shoot for a body condition score of 5, possibly 4.5 if they've got some laminitis issues. Omegas are a huge thing in terms of giving the horse some anti-inflammatories and having those available to them. So if the horse is not able to eat a lot of pasture, then sources of omegas can come from dietary supplementation. And there's omega-3s and omega-6s, and unfortunately, 6s are the inexpensive ones, and there's a fair bit of those in our horse diets anyway. Omega-3s come from a lot of either flax or fish oils are probably the best source of those. And they do a great job for inflammation in a horse. Vitamin E is also antioxidant, and then for especially PSSM horses, using dietary fats to help them manage their weight and give them energy from that instead of from any sugars if they need those. So knowing what is the right kind of hay to feed your horse, I always gets a little sad when I hear people talk about a hay being high quality or hay being low quality. For me, and looking at it from a nutrient content perspective, for me, high quality hay is hay that is free of dust and mold and has the appropriate fiber content that the horse is going to be able to both chew it and then the hindgut bugs be able to digest it. And that is very different for different horses. That's very individual. And anything that's not in the hay, if you can buy hay that's clean to feed and so forth, all the other nutrients we can make up for with concentrates. It's just that from a dietary standpoint, both physical health and mental health, if we can base our diet mostly on forages, then that's better. So for every horse, that quality hay, what is appropriate quality is going to be a little bit different. But ideally, as many small meals as you can possibly manage if you can't do free choice forages. If your horse is able to tolerate free choice forages, at first it may look like they're going to try to eat you out of house and home, but there really is a lot of research coming out showing that if we allow horses to have free choice of particularly low sugar hay, they will learn to manage themselves. They will not eat themselves to death as long as they don't have metabolic issues or weight issues that you're trying to look after. But for the most part, if a horse has free choice forages, once their gut fills up and the hormones in their body that tell them keep eating, keep eating, keep eating, get satisfied, which can take some time for the body to adapt. If we've been feeding 2 times a day to free choice forages, it's going to take a long time for the horse's body to figure that out. But that they will learn to adapt to that, and that they have fewer spikes in insulin and all the things that go with that. And just mentally, they're better off when they have free choice of forages. If you can't do that, then certainly enrichment activities, whether it's a stabled horse or one that lives outside that can't be having free choice feed, you can use things such as spreading out their hay. And if you live in a windy place like we do here, I've oftentimes stuffed hay nets similar to this hay pillow that's in the picture. So this is one that's meant to be tossed out into the pasture or in a stall. And you can use this as long as your horse doesn't have shoes on, because they could get their shoes caught in that mesh. But I've hung hay nets around the outside of the pasture if the hay is just going to blow away out of it. then I can set it up so that they have to at least walk around. It's really easy this time of year when it's cold out and unpleasant to just throw the bale over the fence and tell them see you later, and then they don't move at all to eat. They just stay right there. So if you can move it around and make them move around a little bit more, both for the exercise level, but the enrichment of having to kind of look for their food, it makes more sense to their physiology as well as their mental health. Oftentimes, too, giving them toys or things that can deliver treats in a slow fashion to engage their mind as well as give them something to munch on. Most hay stretcher pellets, you can get the bigger ones. I just use a milk jug. I fill it with hay stretcher pellets, which I know are low NSC, which essentially are just made of chopped up hay. And I can toss that into the pasture, into a stall with a horse, and they get lots of entertainment knocking around the milk jug, having it dispense little bits of forage pellets as it goes, and so forth. It can get really loud and distracting. So make sure you don't have a lesson going on that a horse is going to be upset by this noise if you've got someone playing with milk jugs with rattles in them before you set them free. Inflammation management is really key for these older or at-risk horses. And certainly, so then starting with a balanced diet. So forage analysis, and then having someone work with you with a ration balancing program. And like I said, almost every feed company will offer these kinds of services, whether they will take the hay analysis for you if they've got a core and can send that in. And then most of them have a computer program that they can work out a basic ration for you. And there are certainly plenty of great nutritionists available as well. But starting with a balanced diet before you start spending money on supplements and things like that is, a little bit more money maybe right up front, but if you're not spending lots of money on supplements you don't need, it's going to save you money in the long run, and you're going to make sure you fill in some gaps. Different parts of the country have very different needs in terms of, either their selenium deficiencies or too much selenium in some parts of the country. So those, wherever you are, your feed company is, that you're working with already can certainly help you start with a balanced diet. There's some herbal supplements that are great for anti-inflammatories, or a horse if they need to be on a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, and the thought of putting a horse on daily bute is a little bit difficult because bute can be a little hard on their stomach. There's some herbal supplements such as, devil's claw and yucca, things like that can be really helpful for horses that are a little easier on their stomach. And different horses react to those differently. Like I said before, the omegas, and then vitamins and minerals. I think vitamin E, at least for horses that aren't getting a whole lot of pasture anymore, such as Morgans like we have, and where we've got snow in the winter, they're not getting a whole lot of fresh grass, which is the major dietary source of vitamin E. We are now feeling like we're seeing more vitamin E related issues. The NRC, or the National Research Council, who puts out the information about the research on horse nutrition, we're coming to find out that information about vitamin E, at least, is horribly out of date. So we're really needing to see that horses need more vitamin E in their diets. So we're striving for balance. Feed each horse as an individual. Seek veterinary advice when it makes sense, whether it's for blood tests for a horse that might have Cushing's or to see if they've got insulin resistance. We're always looking for that balance between physical and mental health as well. The mental health part of horses is they're meant to walk around and eat 16 hours a day. If you've got a horse with some laminitis issues and otherwise, then eating 16 hours a day on pasture isn't going to make sense. So we're always trying to find that balance between the two of those so that we have a physically healthy horse that's mentally ready for the job we're asking them to do. And at this point, my slide got cut off, but I would like to see if anybody has any questions at all.
Hi, Karen. I have one that was sent to me. I have a question for horses with gastric ulcers. Do you have any tips or possible feed additives that may help mitigate flares?
So my understanding, research shows that omeprazole is essentially the only medication that we know of, at least for the foregut ulcers. Hindgut ulcers are a kind of a different critter. Foregut ulcers are when the stomach, which is meant to have food in it all the time, isn't as full because we're not feeding them as much, they're not eating as often. So that portion of the stomach that's not protected is suddenly now open and available to getting stomach acid bounced up on it. So one of the things we can do to try to help that is certainly more smaller meals. Free choice forage is the way to go. Aloe juice is a great addition if you can get the horse to eat it. I know a lot of people have great success with it. I've only had about half the horses I've offered aloe juice to will readily slurp that up. And it worked out better in horses that had diets that were eating wet diets. They were more inclined to eat it. Horses that I had that were eating more dry food were not as excited about aloe juice. So you may need to introduce that one slowly. There's some good evidence too that giving horses some alfalfa pellets can help improve that. So the alfalfa hay. Alfalfa has a lot of calcium in it, and calcium is a good buffer for stomach acid. Think of it as Tums for horses. And so people have said oftentimes, especially if you're going to go out and work a horse, that if you can give them a cup, and I'm talking like a measuring cup, which is probably about a half to 3/4 of a pound of alfalfa pellets, maybe 45 minutes to an hour or so before you go out to work them. As they move around and their stomach contents are sloshing and the stomach contents are splashing up onto the non-protected parts of the stomach, we may have reduced the acid some by having those alfalfa pellets in there, having that calcium available to them. So those are some of the dietary things that I'm aware of that work well for ulcers. But for the most part, ulcers come from the stomach not having food in it for longer periods of time. So the more we can have food in front of them, the better off we are. Some people have had great luck with slow feed hay nets, similar to that hay pillow that I showed you, but I have not had here personally. We've done some research and we actually even timed horses, and we had horses that got faster with that hay net. It was something to see. Watch this mare figure out how to make the hay move faster out of the hay net than she could eat it off the ground. There's potentially also some issues with hay nets in terms of, if you're not hanging them low enough, that they're getting the respiratory issues, as well as, they've got to turn their head a little bit different. They're using their jaw and teeth differently than if they were grazing or just picking up hay off of the ground. So it'd be things to just be aware of. There's certainly, I know farms that have had great luck using slow feed hay nets for the horses, but they haven't necessarily worked that well for me on the situations I've tried to use them in. I use them more to keep hay from blowing away out in the pastures. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. And have you ever used probiotics with your herd at Minor Institute?
As a matter of course, I don't feed probiotics. I keep probiotics on hand for horses that have had some digestive upset. So if I've had a horse that either had a bad reaction to deworming or had been sick, that had to be on antibiotics, if a horse had been sick and was getting treated with SMZs or some other injectable antibiotic, once that antibiotic has run its course, I'll do a course of probiotics to help just support that hindgut population of the horse to keep it normal. But for the most part, if the horse is eating a balanced diet and you're not changing it all the time on them, they've got a pretty good collection of hindgut bugs on their own.
Perfect. And then I think those might be the only 2 questions we have. If anyone is typing, there's a little hand on your control bar. You can raise that and let me know that you're in the process. And I wanted to thank everyone who joined us today. And Karen, of course, thank you for leading such an important conversation to promote equine health and wellness. To participate in more learning opportunities with distinguished professionals like Karen in our equine industry, keep an eye on your Path International Communications. And let's see, just checking the questions one more time. I think we are all set, Karen. So
great.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I know the web address got cut off, but www.whminor.org is Minor Institute's website. And my contact information is readily available through there. And if I would be happy to answer questions afterwards, or if anybody ever is in Northeast New York and wants to come visit.
Thank you, Karen. You're so kind. We hope to see everyone next time. Take care.
Bye-bye.